Why was she murdered?
Diane Fosse fell in love with the gorillas and fell out of love with her own tribe, which in her case meant the pressure, the human pressure on her gorillas, on her. She very much identified with trying to save these animals. In the next 2 days, we went up to the research station with her casket, and she was buried in a graveyard that she had created for her poached gorillas. And there are pictures of mine of her casket covered with flowers. And across the telex feed, my photos went out around the world, and I can't really know how many papers picked them up.
It starts with just taking that leap.
Man, you have to work hard. You have to be incredibly smart.
Choose something that even if it fails, you are going to be proud of it.
Doesn't matter how badly you got beaten in battle.
Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Become a better person, a better leader, a better business.
Go with your gut. I'm Samuel Donner, and this is Finding Founders. You just heard from Brenton Kelly describing the lead up to the murder of American conservationist Diane Fosse in Rwanda. Employing rigorous anti-poaching methods towards the end of her life, Fosse made more than a few enemies. But how do Fosse's and Brenton's stories connect? Well, we'll get to that later. Let's introduce Brenton first. He's the treasurer and advocacy director of Quail Springs Permaculture, living far away from Africa in Socal's Cuyama Valley. There, he helps advocate for sustainable groundwater policies in the region's wetlands and works to include earthen building materials in California's outdated building code. To get an up-and-close look at Brenton's unusual lifestyle and find answers to some of my burning questions, I traveled a few hours outside of Los Angeles to stay a couple days at Quail Springs. I arrived late at night and found that here, immersed in this remote farmland, stars were much brighter and the mornings were full of new experiences, including squeezing goat milk right from the teat into a cup of coffee. After we got settled, Brenton, a couple dozen goats, and I traveled a few miles from the homestead to begin the interview surrounded by nature. We'll get back into the podcast right after this break. Billion Dollar Moves, hosted by Sarah Chen Spellings, is brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. Join venture capitalist and strategist Sarah Chen Spellings as she asks the hard questions so you too can make billion-dollar moves in venture, in business, and in life. Billion-dollar moves with a B. You know how many zeros that is? Too many to count. But you know what else is too many to count? The number of just banger episodes in this podcast. There's one titled, I Am More Than My Startup, with this emotional AI pioneer. Basically, Sarah delves into a discussion on the ethics of AI because these things maybe are going to take over the world. We want to make sure that they're like nice AI rather than matrix AI. We want them to be like AI that just like, you know, puts you to sleep and pays for your taxes, not AI that's like, I'm going to use you as a battery and power my matrix world. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, you should check out Billion Dollar Moves wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to the podcast.
I was born in northern Rhodesia and celebrated my first independence at my first birthday when northern Rhodesia became Zambia. Also lived in the Congo and Senegal and Nigeria and East Africa and Kenya.
So you bounced like all around Africa.
A couple of years at a time, and we would live in country in Lusaka or Kinshasa or Nairobi, and I'd go to an American school in country, and my father would travel, you know, his beat around that portion of Africa, coming home regularly, and we could track his activities by listening to the Voice of America that night and know whether he was in Uganda or Ethiopia. And so while my father was off, you know, earning the income and covering the war stories, my mother and my brother and I would take off in her little convertible Peugeot. This is in Nigeria in '66. During the weekend, we would pack up like a frozen orange juice bottle and some sandwiches, drive down the end of what I thought was the end of any random road. And when we got there, there would be a little community, a little town, a dot on the map with an interesting name. Often at the end of the road, there'd be a marketplace, and there would be a community event going on where all sorts of individuals were selling their wares, much of which were produced in their homes and in their bandas, in their farms around their homes. And there was an exchange going on, often without coin. It's not true barter, it's credit, not debt. So credit is, I know I've got a patch of corn growing, but it's going to be ripe in 2 months, and you've got a patch of yams that need to be eaten today. I'll eat your yams if you'll help me eat my corn come fall. That's a credit system where we don't have to exchange coin, but we get our needs met as a relationship. So we would have our picnic and sit in the shade of the market trees and watch these incredibly colorful events take place.
Everything you mentioned sounds idyllic, but you're also in fairly unstable countries. Can you speak to some of those experiences of maybe like the instability of sometimes growing up in places like this?
In general, the atmosphere was one of independence revolution. So the instability was in many ways a positive thing because it was overcoming colonialism. So when Northern Rhodesia became Zambia, it was a great celebration, even though it involved soldiers on the streets with guns that killed people. I was fairly sheltered from the militarized side of it. However, we went to schools that were compounds that had guards, and there were soldiers on street corners and at checkpoints that had real guns. And the use of weaponry was always something of a tool of control for me, witnessing, that's why there were guns in the world. In Asia, we lived in Thailand, in Bangkok, when, the conflict was over in Vietnam.
Yeah, can you tell me about moving over there?
It was just one of the many. So we were coming from our post in Washington, D.C. and going to a new home and a new school. And this one was in 71 in Bangkok was, Bangkok was pretty well built up from the military industrial complex. The school that I went to was a huge campus for elementary and high school. And all of my classmates were Americans whose parents were officers, not just enlisted men who could have their families in country. So, we were in country for 2.5 years. I would make friends the first year, and then they would leave that next year. And so there was never kind of much of the consistency of what it meant to be in a hometown. In the case of not having a lot of childhood friends, I learned very well how to be my own best friend. And that's not a skill set that you get easily, or one that one would choose to pursue if given the option of having a lot of close friends. However, I see that as an asset. I don't depend on my relationships for my own identity, yet I treasure them.
But eventually, you move from these intact cultures back to the US. I know you were kind of going in and out of Washington, D.C., but you did eventually go to high school in D.C. And I can imagine that the US felt a lot different from the other places you had lived.
What struck me in the States was literally that in Thailand and in the Congo, there were multiple sources of water that were a spectrum from salty dishwater to relatively clean, clear bath water, to cooking water, to actually drinking water that you could drink pure. And those went through a variety of different sources. They weren't all from the same place. Some of it was purchased, some of it was filtered, some of it was boiled. And you would never trust that a faucet delivered a specific thing, or that even if you turned the faucet on or tried to flush the toilet or fill up the bath, that there'd be water there at that time to do it.
But in DC, it was always there.
It was you threw the switch and the light would come on. You have water at the kitchen sink, you knew it was drinking water.
What did that feel like for you?
My parents had drilled into me, pay attention to where your source is so that you know you're drinking good water and don't drink any of this bad stuff. And then I get to this place where everybody can always assume, by way of paying taxes, that they don't have to think about that. They don't have to think about where the water comes from, where the electricity comes from, where the waste goes to, any of those things.
So that, I think, on an individual and structural level, obviously big change, but on a social level, what were the people that you were encountering and also how do you identify with the people that live in the States?
My high school experience was at a small private school, so I didn't go to the public school, and most of the students were also international and diplomatic. So there was unique perspectives amongst my peers, not your standard, Midwesterner perspective. I had some neat friends, but my experience through high school was, I could blame my youth experience overseas as, disruptive to my academic development to some degree, yes. But by the time I got to high school, it was evident that I wasn't where my peers were. And part of that was dyslexia, a learning disability that had not been diagnosed. And so dyslexia is a fabulous gift that gives the individual even more of a unique perspective on the world. And I think we all have a spectrum on that, where our senses are able to pick up the world the way our neurons are able to, and that's very unique between individuals. So even the same environment that we may grow up with, the same social feedbacks that we may, be exposed to, we're all going to have our own unique experience there. And it was very much brought to my attention with my parents and overseas and cultural sensitivity to the religions and the practices of in country, that everything is valid.
How are you starting to think about college and your life moving forward in a world that is standardized tests, that is a lot of reading, that is just like a systems and organization?
When I think back at that period, I think much more fondly and deeply about my relationships with my teachers than with my peers. They knew what they were working with. They knew my history. By the time I graduated, I had been in one place for 5 years, the longest I'd ever lived anywhere, 4 of those in this one school. And the school was small enough and liberal enough that, we called our professors by their first name. And my first teacher always had an open door to me walking into her office to talk. And I had classes that were extremely challenging. And then I would have a class where the professor really thrilled me. I'm not a math student, and I loved geometry, and I loved my geometry teacher. And I loved the fact that, 2 dots define a line. That's not math, that's real. 2 lines that intersect define an angle. That's measurable, that's real. And then I think I fell in love with my biology teacher. And she helped me kind of master the test-taking skill requirements of the field and the memorization of biology, along with the pure joy of learning life science. And so she taught an AP advanced placement biology class that she insisted I take, and she helped me take the AP tests and get good scores on my tests. By accommodating my dyslexia, it was a very fortunate opportunity to go to the school I did. And I couldn't find that when I went to college.
How did you think about college? Did you apply to a bunch of ones?
Well, my father had entered the Foreign Service from California. He was born and raised here. So I could get state resident tuition. So I knew I was going to California, and I applied to several of the UC systems. My dad had done undergraduate work at UC Berkeley. So he was thrilled for me to apply to Berkeley, and as alumni, he was happy to support that endeavor. And I had traveled around the world quite a bit to recognize that Santa Barbara got a lot of those most beautiful aspects of the planet. And they had a really good aquatic biology department, which is what I thought I was going to be pursuing. Once I got to college, a couple of things happened. One was I fell in love with photography and started working at the local newspaper. And then another thing was I got recruited out of the meal line while I was waiting for breakfast by a very short person who was the coxswain for the varsity rowing boat. And the next morning I was out rowing. And rowing, which involved, sitting on my butt and going backwards every morning, was the best way I found to get through college.
Why?
Because it gave me an accomplishment that I could get done by 9 o'clock classes that exceeded what most people did in the daytime. Just this summer, we had a 40th anniversary of the 1982 editorial board of the Daily Nexus.
And that's the paper that you're doing.
That's the newspaper. And one of the unique things that we all shared was that many folks in that newsroom felt that they were adrift and couldn't find their tribe until they walked into that newsroom.
Did you feel the same way?
Very much so. The photo editor that got me on board, that, got me into being a photo editor the next year, and that I mentored the assistant editor and Muda, that was an incredible batch of people similarly focused on a mission, which was this little daily rag that came out every day that needed a pretty picture to make it look good and support the journalists who were putting it together. And ironically, though, Santa Barbara doesn't have a journalism department. So there were no professors in the room. There were no grades being put on the articles and the paper and the photos or any of the content. There were a handful of professionals who made sure that the ads were sold that paid for everything, but none of the activity contributed to the graduation of any of the students.
So just for the pure love of it.
And a little bit of beer money. When you're an editor, you got a stipend. But I learned that I could take my graphic art from that I had been paid to shoot and put on the front page or the cover page of the arts and entertainment section or some of there are a lot of creative things. I could take it across the quad to the art department and take a class in printmaking and make a lithograph out of this photo or this photo montage or something and print it out on a limestone slate and pull prints off of it and get a grade for that. And I graduated in art studio.
2 for the price of 1.
Yep. I was able to sit on my ass and go backwards on the rowing team and take pictures all day and then make art studio prints and lithographs and silk screens. And that was, kind of identified with my father, identifying journalism and it's like one of the things I loved doing was, in the early 80s, Diablo Canyon Nuclear Facility was just coming online. And there was great protests because, it's built right on fault lines and they used the plans upside down when they built it. And a number of substantial issues that were coming up before commissioning of it. And there were a number of actions to block the entrance. And a bunch of my friends would participate. And so we would drive up there and my friends would, get their placards out and stand in line and they'd get rounded up by the police and I'd be there taking pictures of them and take pictures of them. I have a press pass, so I could be behind the line taking pictures of them being put in the buses and heading off and waving goodbye. And then I get to cross over the line and go back to the office and print that picture and get them on the front page the next day while they spent the night in jail.
Wow.
I got to sleep in my bed.
So as you were graduating from UCSB, where do you take these skills?
Well, another great fortune of my timing. Shortly after graduating, I went back to Africa to visit my father.
Why did you go?
He was living in Kigali, Rwanda. And the day I arrived in Kigali, which is a little town in Rwanda that has one flight a week coming out of Nairobi into country, and they only access. And the day I flew was the day that Diane Fosse was murdered up at her research camp at Karasoki in the Rwenzori of the mountain gorilla territory of Rwanda.
Can you tell me who Diane Fosse is?
Diane Fosse was one of the 3 primate women that Louis Leakey, the National Geographic anthropologist, set up to study the 3 most closely related primates to humans, the chimpanzee, and we know Jane Goodall. Diane Fosse was set up with the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
Why was she murdered?
Diane Fosse fell in love with the gorillas and fell out of love with her own tribe, which in her case meant the pressure, the human pressure on her gorillas, she very much identified with trying to save these animals. And there was not so much direct pressure against the gorillas as much as the need for poaching bush meat by the locals to feed themselves. So she was taking very personally something that was a hard to avoid situation with a hungry population and a nature reserve full of food.
So basically, like, her advocacy was upsetting the people who needed just basic needs.
Yep. She made a few enemies. I arrived in Kigali with my father being a freelance retired journalist. We were able, in the next 2 days, we went up to the research station with her casket. She had been brought down to Kigali and then taken back up to her research station when it was determined that that's where she would remain. And we escorted her into the Rwenzori's. She was portered in on the back of 8 of her trackers and staff of the research station. And she was buried in a graveyard that she had created for her poached gorillas. And there are pictures of mine of her casket covered with flowers that we brought up.
So you took pictures of the casket?
I was the only photographer in the procession, if we would call it that. It was quite a hike to get up into the research. There's no road up there.
When you took those pictures, did you realize what the significance of what you were capturing?
Yeah, I was able to realize it. And when I arrived in Kigali, I said, Diane who? But that was what was happening. It was like, it was an international issue. She was an American. No one knew whether she was going to be going back to America, in a casket or what. And the embassy was very much involved, and my father was involved with the embassy.
We'll get back into the podcast right after this break. I feel like we just started the year and it's already crazy. I'm about to take a little trip to Patagonia in February. So when you're listening to this, I may be trekking through the mountains. It's been a crazy year between traveling and doing this podcast and the myriad of other projects I have going on. And as a leader, I know that it can be challenging to align your teams on a shared mission and goals for the year. But with the HubSpot CRM, you can keep your marketing, sales, operations, and service teams in sync on one powerful platform. And it grows your business and leaves your competition in the dust. So what can it do? What can it do? Well, it captures leads, boosts sales, and engages customers, all from one powerful platform. Emphasis on the power, which means you can spend less time managing your software and more time connecting with your customers. Learn how HubSpot can help your business grow better at HubSpot.com. And now, back to the podcast. And so when you're capturing this, you realize you're capturing something important, but like where do you think this photo is going?
Well, the next steps were, thanks to my father, he had a colleague in Kenya at the Associated Press who had agreed to take his story, the written story of what was happening, because he was the only journalist putting that out. And then he said, go meet his other daughter, who was, this was right after New Year's, so she was returning. She was 13, my sister, returning to Europe to go back to school, flew out of Kigali at the next flight 2 days after the funeral, and carried my film to Nairobi and handed it over to the Associated Press. And so that then goes out on the wire, which any newspaper around the world can register with the wire, and they get a feed of the international news photos that AP is putting out. And across the telex feed, my photos went out around the world, and I can't really know how many papers picked them up. And I think it was $20 a photo, so I got $100 check from the AP Wire photo for these photos
that went around the world. $100, wow!
Because there were 4 photos. Yeah. But the real gold mine there was that they had put my name on the credit.
Yeah. Did it change your view of pursuing photography professionally?
I think it certainly did. I continued my travels around Africa with my camera bag and dragging, this equipment all around the place, knowing that, wow, what's the likelihood of ever being in the right place at the right time like that? Something was happening that no one else was going to capture. Will I get it right? Will it be meaningful? What will it do? But realizing that I can't count on a business where I can be pulling that off. I love my camera. I love taking good pictures, but wow, that's not really going to pay for my flight back home.
And so it just didn't seem attainable. So when you did go back home, how did you get involved with the parks agency?
So I went back to Isla Vista, with a community next to the university where I went.
What prompted the move back?
The contacts that I had. My junior year, I moved into a group house, and it was the first sort of real communal with a number of folks, mostly students, but also Matt Buckmaster, who's my business partner at Island Seed and Feed. We were college roommates back then. So coming back, staying with him, we had a beautiful garden, and I loved to see my garden I had never had a garden until then. And then when you leave a garden that you've been deeply rooted into, even when you're traveling through amazing places on the other side of the world, you think back to that tomato that you planted and go, I wonder how my tomatoes are doing. How's that garlic getting on? Oh my God, I want to see my garden. And that kind of attachment to that place. So I was very attracted back to Isla Vista. And Matt at the time had just started to supervise the Isla Vista street sweeping program, which is a trash pickup program. And I got in on that. I really fell in love with picking up trash. Matt and I still pick up trash once a month. It's a very rewarding activity. But I started working with the park district there, and then got into the grounds management side of things, where we were tending the parks and building the facilities and maintaining them.
So as you got more involved in this life with the parks, did photography take a backseat?
It certainly did. Yeah. I picked up a different tool belt, gained a lot of different skill sets, like tractoring.
Was that hard to give up, or did it feel like a next step?
It felt like a next step. I felt like I had done the type of photography that I really loved doing. And for me, that at the nexus was working in the black and white darkroom. And now at that point, there was only black and white on the newspaper. And now there's color, and now it's all digital, and it's a different world. And I knew at the time that I wouldn't enjoy that as much. I wouldn't be able to mix up Fixer and those stinky chemicals and dump them down the drain and deal with, silver nitrate, which is not great stuff. So I had a conflict in my own mind about my organic interests and dealing with these chemicals, and go, well, it sure makes sense to go digital, but I don't think that that's what I want to do.
So as you went into the parks area, was it all smooth sailing?
I had a little over 10 years working there, and I came in and it was golden. It was great. My boss was amazing. The organization was really smooth, and a bunch of friends worked together. And shortly after getting, full-time employment there was a political change at the board of directors, fired the GM that hired me, and installed someone who was much more difficult to work with. And
when you say difficult, do you mean like an asshole, or do you mean like...
To be generous to the man, he had great mechanical intelligence and not much social intelligence, or, the compassionate way is to say, emotional intelligence, I should say. So as an engineer, he was great at one end of his job, but he didn't know how to work with people, plants, children.
And how did that show up?
That showed up in a number of ways that really upset people. There's a lot of by the books. The grounds crew was contracted out to a private enterprise.
And so he's just taking away jobs from people.
And trying to save money because he represented the property owners who didn't like the fact that the park district was riding an enterprise on their tax dollars.
When do you end up leaving, and how?
It was difficult for me, because I actually succeeded in outliving that particular general manager. But at the same time, early on, I had started to actually develop a physical back ailment that was work related. And at one point I was quite debilitated and got into therapy and had a lunch date with my physician at a brown bag lunch at the hospital, where a bunch of back folks talk about things, case review, and they all suggested this condition that I'd never heard of, that they all seemed to know about, called the Paul Bunyan syndrome. Well, the physical levering over a longer body length creates a condition that may have helped me rowing tremendously. It's a tall man's sport, but was a disadvantage when I was lifting a trash can out of a trash can holder, because my arms are straight out. The heavier lift is a much more impact on the lower back. So I was actually told that I was in the wrong business, even though I loved my job.
So you had to leave.
I kind of said, I have to find a way out of here.
And I'd love to actually, take this pivot, getting back together with your old friend Matt Buckmaster, who was your college roommate,
who had been fired. He was a grounds manager or grounds worker with me for many of those years, but he was one of the individuals that lost their job. And so he was doing other work. And one day he and I were over at our local feed store, where a dear friend of ours was running a business that was getting to be about 10 years old. Matt and I were both in the store one morning, And we're talking to Phil. No one else is in the store. And Phil's telling us for the first time that Phil and Ellen want to retire. They want to sell the business. And we go, oh my gosh, who would you sell it? How would you do that? Because we come here to know you and this is your place and you're in John. What would John, how would you do this? Who would you sell it? How would you put it on the market? Legitimate concerns as customers that my buddy and I were pressing. And Phil said, well, we're hoping to sell it to you guys. They had already decided that Matt and I would make perfect owners of their business. And I was still employed at the Park District, and Matt was working as a landscaper. And we go like, what? And Matt and I look at each other and we go like, well, that could be real.
How?
So we spent a year while I was still employed at the Park District training and working with Phil and learning what the inventory was, looking, the cash flow requirements. I went back to school and took an economics course at UCSB with all these future accountants. And I'm just like, what does QuickBook do when I enter this? What do I need to know? A balance sheet? What is this? I'm like bonehead, and I'm stepping in as the dyslexic accountant to this. I became the chief financial officer of Island Seed and Feed. So after a year, it never went on the market. We really just rolled it over. And on January 1st of 1999, we exchanged inventory and they opened up the door the next morning under our name.
What did that feel like?
Oh, that was exciting. It was a whole new world for me. My buddy is an artist. Many of my buddies are, but Matt is an amazing creative artist. He's the most socially or emotionally intelligent person I know. He can make friends with anybody. I loved the plants and the business, but knew that I didn't want him to be doing the books because as a creative bookkeeper, it would have been done different every month. And I knew that wasn't the way to do it and that I should figure out at least a way to do it once correctly and get it done every month correctly and make sure the bills are paid.
How does the business develop towards 2004, 2005?
Well, the first year was a wild one. There was construction going on at the over ramp. So it's one of the monikers of the store is that it's the coolest, little, hardest to find store on the South Coast. And we are underneath the freeway overpass on a road that nobody knows is under the overpass. And so we're always talking people into how to find the place. But then there's this construction detour. It's quite noisy and dangerous. And then this was in 1999, which if anybody lived through that era, was the great Y2K. And we were a retail store involved with, I would call it a permaculture store. It wasn't in our nomenclature, but we sold permaculture literature and we were promoting all the things that fit into permaculture. And a lot of that, even reasonable members of the community were quite fixated with the notion that the world was about to end and that maybe the dog food wouldn't show up, much less their food resiliency. So
they wanted to stock up.
They wanted to stock up, including on the garden. We had the best garden sales. We sell our own seedlings of vegetables. So we're feeding the backyard gardens of Goleta and selling an enormous number of chickens as little baby chicks. Everybody that year thought that it was going to be necessary to have half a dozen birds in their backyard.
So business was booming.
Business was booming. And it was also, we were looking at each other going people want to buy big containers with locking lids for airtight, okay, here's a pallet of these things. And they all sold immediately. It was wow. And then after a year of running the place, we walked in on January 2nd and the computer turned on and the register turned on and the delivery truck showed up and we kept on working and there was no Y2K.
I'd love to track up to meeting, I think, some people that would be important and talking to some people that would be important, Warren Brush and Paul Swenson.
Yeah. Well, my daughter at this point was 7 or 8 and she's starting to really love the outdoors and we've gone camping a few times and there's an organization in Goleta called the Wilderness Youth Project that does wilderness awareness, nature immersion activities with youth. So I was trying to get Iris involved in those programs And I met Warren, the executive director of Wilderness Youth Project, when he came into Island Seed and Feed and announced that they had just closed escrow on 450 acres up in the Los Padres back in Cuyama. And the logic there made a lot of sense. Warren said that they had been looking for a place to go with the kids' programs that was not just the end of the road campsite that accesses the national forests and all the great playgrounds to take kids, but was a place where you could actually live the experience of a sustainable energy, food, water, shelter situation. Wanting to take kids to a place where there wasn't just a dumpster that removed things or a pit toilet that buried stuff, but that was actually in as intact a sustainable example as possible, because the kids were asking for that. And so this property was purchased, and Paul Swenson and Warren Brush were the main caretakers with their families.
So this was your like the first step in.
Yeah, actually the first step in was shortly after talking to Warren and Paul in the parking lot at Island Seed and Feed and saying, well, I want to get my kid involved. He says, oh, we're doing the summer program, we can get her in. And the summer program was a 2-week program where the first week we dropped her off downtown and they picked her up and they went off to all these very cool places around Santa Barbara, the ocean, rock climbing in the hills, rivers, and, backcountry. And then they come back and I'd pick her up and bring her home. And she had a great time with this really cool set of kids with these great mentors, and we're doing all this neat stuff. And the second week, I dropped her off on Monday and they got driven out to Quail Springs. And she came back on Friday, and then that weekend, there was a family camp where the parents of all the kids involved with the summer programs were welcomed out to Quail Springs for this kind of weekend event. And even picking up Iris at that Friday morning before we packed back up and went back out here, that she had changed. She was this confident, beaming, she's the one that said, Brenton, you got to check this place out. And then to come right back out and have her show me this place through the eyes of what she had experienced for the week was transformative in that alone. I mean, it had changed. My daughter had found something in herself that she hadn't seen before. And that was what this place could do. It was the nonprofit was called the True Nature Society, which is a reflection on our own sort of innate skills and offerings and attractions as individuals of how we can rise to meet the world from our own true nature.
And so you wanted to get more involved, but I think something that is unique or something that every large piece of land needs to be sustainable for a group of people is water, right? And at this point, what was the water situation of Quail Springs? Like you said, there was this pond, but was it sustainable?
The pond was plumbed from the spring, and the spring is about a 3/4, almost a mile up canyon from where the farm and the pond is. It was a trickle in a wallowed out, eroded gully. And this was due to 75 years of cattle management where the cows were just able to sit up in the spring under the cottonwood trees and eat all the green sedge and all the willow sprouts and strip all the leaves off the cottonwood trees as best they could. That caused the water to drain out of the aquifer and looked like the spring was dying. The first thing Quail Springs did was deny the cattle permits, and it started to recover on its own. And it was the beginning of what my wife and I truly feel was a relationship, a courtship that involved, the work we were doing on the board of directors and the fundraising we were doing to support it, but slowly a courtship between us and the land.
And so how did you begin to improve the land? What did you start to do?
I was still working at the business, and so we had the obvious ability to help facilitate the food systems. We brought the first clutch of chickens out, we brought all the vegetables for the first garden, and continued to support the development of the farm and food systems while Paul and Warren were were living here and developing the water catchment. I wasn't as aware of that at the time, except that they were able to barely squeak by with the volume that they were getting, and we put the tanks in and improved that storage capacity.
This seems like the homesteading opportunity that you'd been waiting for, right?
Yeah, but even still, Jan and I, were talking on the drive out the day that they asked, and we were like, it was becoming obvious in the courtship that something was developing of permanence. And it's like, could we live here? I was like, oh man, it's just so hot and there's no place to live. And it's like, there's some of the things that I don't know how they're doing it. And like, how uncomfortable is that? And yeah, it is amazing. We couldn't at that time convince ourselves that, we gotta talk ourselves into living here. It's like, that was not the situation. And it was part of that courtship development. And it involved their solicitation. Like, we would like you to come out and help us set up the farm. We'd like you to be farm managers. We need you. And, I've got a kid in middle school and I've got a business. And it's like, well, even if that were how would we do that? It's kind of like buying the business. It took more than a year. And I spent the year setting up basically to divest from the business. We were co-owners, and I couldn't really be a co-owner out here. I couldn't do, Matt needed to be a sole proprietor. And so that was a rearrangement. I moved from being the chief executive officer to being the bookkeeper here at Quail Springs as the best customer at Island Seed and Feed. We moved more produce more feed and product than any other customer. So two of the most immediate needs at Quail Springs were developing the food systems, which needed water, and developing shelter for the inhabitants. Not a very comfortable place to be in a tent. It's very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter, and the temperature can swing on any day of the calendar, can swing over 50 degrees. So certainly the element of shelter was priority, and we brought some folks in on the land who were natural builders. Building with natural materials, it's a broad, a log cabin or a stone house could be considered natural building.
You could also have hay bales.
Hay bales or earthen cob.
So you brought these earth builders
earthen builders who had experience on building, and in particular, we had a workshop to build the house for Paul and Colmy out of cob. A cob structure, which is a 12 or more inch thick earthen freeform. So instead of making adobe bricks and stacking them on a wall, you actually take the same material and like a pinch pot in ceramics, apply that wet cob to the top of the wall and build roundish walls are stronger than straight walls.
So you start to build up these cob houses, but I'm wondering what the feds and the city are thinking of these structures.
We were very much aware that these structures would not be easily received by the building code officials at the county. The lawyers at the county will not allow the county to approve a building that they have any reason to think might cause liability to the county in the future. And the irony of it is the building code. Is there an engineer who has put their stamp on it?
So to prove it to the feds, how do you find yourself in Texas?
Well, we are working with a number of engineers and architects who are advancing or advocating for getting a code for this material. You would build a portion of a structure and then roll it into a kiln where they blast it with fire for a certain number of hours, and then generally try to extinguish and hit it with a fire hose. So the combination of cooking it really hot for a while and then dousing it with the water will give you a fire rating. Well, we would have to do this to get a fire code for cob, and it involved finding the laboratory, which isn't in California, it's in Texas. And then it took about 8 months in southern humid Texas to get that cob to dry. And we discovered something, that the longer the cob wall is exposed to heat, the hotter it gets for the longer period of time, the more resistant it gets to the fire hose because, of course, it's vitrifying and turns towards brick.
So long story short, the cob performs better than like traditional methods.
There isn't any fireproof building material as inexpensive and accessible and fireproof as earth.
Where does this leave, the state of your structures in the eyes of the law today? And what does also just, the future of Quail Springs look like?
One of the biggest things that's happened, during this sort of COVID era, is that we're no longer running as many open door programs for kids and WIP or for schools or offering on-site residential permaculture design courses. We are still doing programming, but most of it is now online or off-site. So there's a certain lack of child giggling echoing through the canyon. Truly something I miss. I think this landscape has some amazing things to offer, and the important part for me as tending this land is making sure that it's accessible. And now we're kind of like trying to figure out what we're going to do program-wise, because this is an experiential location. It's about being here.
And so looking back on this, your story, your meanderings through life, what would you say one of your biggest lessons has been? What, like something that you've learned that maybe you wish you could tell to your younger self, or someone who maybe was on a similar path to you?
An important lesson in my life, and one I encourage people to hone the skill, is long and protracted observation. Pay a lot of attention to what's going on outside of your head, because humans can make assumptions and create a universe within their thought patterns that may or may not reflect the environment that they're observing. We're really good at creating our own realities. And that's a wonderful skill set as well. It's like, don't have someone else tell you what the world looks like. See it for yourself, but pay close attention to it. And I think Quail Springs has been able to go through its various transitions by really observing what it is that it can do best.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, DM us at Finding Founders Podcast on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Finding Founders is produced and hosted by me, Samuel Donner.
Our Chief of Staff and Operations is Jessica Lynn.
Our audio editing team lead is Adrian Tapia. Support from
Irene Van Berkel,
Matt Fernandez,
Renee Buchanan,
Sophia Donner,
David Saide,
Ashley Jimenez,
Nicholas Guzman,
Aaron Devereaux,
Sanessa Gisley,
and Lois Choi.
Our outreach and research lead is Kenny Ong, with support from
Sarah Hobson,
Charisse Tan,
Harushi Kanauchi,
Kristen Hagelin,
Aya Cortez,
and Valencia Lu.
Our writing team lead is Elizabeth Bowen with support from
Aiden Ashworth,
Nikki Mukawa,
Sylvie Wang,
and Eric Mena.
Our design team lead is Shruti Ramanand with support from
Tiffany Dang,
Yao Liu,
and Dina Gabriel.
To see more of what we're up to, subscribe to our newsletter at findingfounders.co. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.